In the early decades of the 20th century, the United States stood at a crossroads. The nation often spoke proudly of freedom and democracy, yet millions of its own citizens lived under a reality that contradicted those ideals. This period, known as the Jim Crow era, shaped the daily lives of countless Black Americans in ways that might seem almost unimaginable today. It was a time when segregation was not only accepted by many, but legally enforced, weaving itself into schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and even the smallest details of ordinary life. Imagine stepping onto a bus and knowing that where you sat was determined not by choice, but by law. Imagine entering a building and finding that every water fountain, waiting room, or restroom carried a sign telling you whether you belonged there or not. Black Americans were denied access to opportunities that others took for granted. They faced restrictions in education, limited job prospects, and barriers that kept them from participating fully in civic life. These rules were designed not just to separate, but to remind them constantly of their place in society as defined by those in power. Yet the story of this era is not only one of hardship. It is also a story of strength. Families built communities where they could support each other. Churches became centers of hope and leadership. Teachers in underfunded schools worked tirelessly to give children the education they deserved. Even in the face of discrimination, people found ways to live, dream, and push toward a better future. Their courage would later spark movements that changed the nation. As we explore this chapter of history, it's important to understand not just the laws, but the human experiences behind them. These stories remind us how fragile justice can be and how essential it is to protect it. They also show us the determination of those who refuse to let unfair rules define their worth. If you find this journey through history meaningful, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the past, stories that still shape the world we live in today. In the towns and cities of the Jim Crow South, the simple act of moving through public spaces was a daily reminder of inequality. Schools were among the first and most visible symbols of this segregation. Black children attended classrooms that were overcrowded, with peeling walls, broken desks, and textbooks that were decades old, passed down from white schools or scavenged wherever they could be found. Teachers, often underpaid and working in difficult conditions, did their best to provide an education, but the stark disparity in resources meant that the future of these students was constrained long before they even graduated. In contrast, white schools boasted well-equipped laboratories, libraries stocked with the latest texts, and playgrounds that nurtured both learning and play. Hospitals and medical care told a similar story. Black patients were frequently confined to separate wards, often with outdated equipment and fewer supplies. In emergency situations, they might wait longer for treatment or be denied certain services entirely. Doctors and nurses serving Black communities often had to improvise with limited resources, and entire hospitals for Black patients were rare, meaning that access to professional medical care was a constant struggle. The consequences were tragic: higher mortality rates and untreated illnesses were far too common. Transportation, too, became a tool for enforcing social hierarchies. Buses and trains had clearly marked sections for Black and white passengers. Black riders were required to give up prime seating and endure crowded, poorly maintained sections. Long-distance travel was particularly challenging, as Black travelers had to plan their journeys around the locations of accommodations, restaurants, and restrooms that would accept them. Guidebooks and word-of-mouth networks became lifelines, providing crucial information about where it was safe to eat or sleep while on the road. Even leisure and public enjoyment were affected. Parks, swimming pools, theaters, and other recreational facilities were either off-limits or segregated. Black communities often had to create their own spaces, which were frequently smaller, less maintained, and lacking in amenities. Libraries, another cornerstone of community learning and enrichment, followed the same pattern. Black libraries were rare, underfunded, and lacked the latest books, while white patrons enjoyed access to abundant, current collections. Restaurants and eateries reinforced this division daily. Black customers were restricted to certain tables or sections, or they were denied service altogether. Many had to rely on small, privately owned establishments within their communities, often operating on shoestring budgets and providing the bare minimum. Even when service was available, it carried the weight of social hierarchy, an ever-present reminder that equality was nowhere to be found in public life. The effect of this systemic separation was more than just inconvenience, it shaped generations' experiences and opportunities. Children grew up with a clear understanding of what society considered their place, and adults navigated the world with constant vigilance, negotiating spaces that were designed to limit their agency and dignity. Yet, despite the limitations imposed by segregated facilities, Black communities created their own networks of support, education, and culture, finding resilience and solidarity in the face of a system that sought to minimize their potential. This pervasive inequality in public life was a cornerstone of Jim Crow, embedding discrimination into everyday experiences and making it nearly impossible for Black Americans to compete on equal footing with their white counterparts. By controlling access to the most basic services, the system reinforced a social order that privileged one group while marginalizing another, leaving marks that would last for generations. In the shadow of the Jim Crow era, fear was an unspoken companion for Black communities across the United States. The threat of racial violence permeated every aspect of daily life, shaping not only how people moved through their towns and neighborhoods but also how they lived and dreamed. Threats could come from individuals, from groups, or from the very institutions that were supposed to uphold the law, creating an environment where Black Americans constantly had to weigh their safety against the simplest acts of daily living. Lynching, a horrifying and public form of terror, was among the most brutal tools of oppression. These were not private acts of violence but spectacles meant to instill fear and enforce compliance. Entire communities would gather to witness these events, with perpetrators often acting with complete impunity. Newspapers sometimes reported on them as if they were social events, with detailed accounts and even photographs, sending a chilling message: defiance, or even perceived disrespect, could lead to a violent and very public death. Families lived under the shadow of such potential atrocities, aware that any perceived transgression could provoke unspeakable consequences. Police and law enforcement often played a dual role. Those sworn to protect were frequently the ones who enforced the social order of white supremacy. Arbitrary arrests, excessive force, and targeted intimidation were daily realities. Black residents might be subjected to sudden stops, searches, or beatings for minor infractions or simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Courts frequently failed to protect the accused, and the legal system often turned a blind eye, leaving victims with little recourse. Justice, in such an environment, was a privilege reserved for some, not a guarantee for all. Mob violence also haunted communities, sometimes erupting spontaneously and other times carefully orchestrated. Groups of armed white individuals would patrol neighborhoods or descend upon gatherings, spreading terror to maintain control. Rumors alone could trigger violent responses, and even the hint of resistance or independence from Black citizens could provoke attacks designed to demonstrate power and instill submission. Stories of people fleeing in the night, hiding from mobs, or enduring beatings simply for asserting their humanity were all too common, leaving lasting scars on entire communities. The psychological toll of such constant danger was immense. Children learned early to navigate streets with caution, to avoid certain areas, and to respect unspoken boundaries dictated by fear. Adults carried the weight of protecting not only themselves but also their families, calculating risks for everything from travel to social interactions. The presence of violence and intimidation created a climate where self-expression and ambition were often stifled, and where survival required both courage and careful planning. Despite the pervasive terror, Black communities developed networks of support and resilience. Churches, local organizations, and extended families became centers of strength, offering safe spaces, education, and guidance. These communities fostered solidarity and a sense of shared purpose, resisting the efforts to erode dignity and hope. Yet the memory of violence and intimidation remained a constant reminder of the systemic power structures they faced. The widespread racial violence of the Jim Crow era was not simply a collection of isolated incidents, it was a deliberate and coordinated system designed to maintain an unequal social hierarchy. By using fear as a tool, white supremacists enforced control and sought to limit the agency of Black Americans. This period serves as a stark historical lesson on the devastating impact of unchecked prejudice and the ways in which terror can be weaponized to suppress entire communities. The legacy of these acts continues to echo through generations, shaping the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. During the Jim Crow era, economic life for Black Americans was a constant struggle against systemic barriers designed to limit opportunity and maintain racial hierarchies. From the moment they entered the workforce, Black men and women faced a landscape defined by restrictions, discrimination, and deeply entrenched inequities. Employment opportunities were often scarce, and when jobs were available, they were typically low-paying and labor-intensive, offering little chance for advancement. Fields, domestic service, and menial labor were the primary options, with positions in skilled trades or management largely reserved for white workers. Even when Black individuals demonstrated skill, competence, and reliability, the color of their skin frequently determined the wages they were offered, creating a system of economic subordination that was nearly impossible to escape. Many Black families relied on sharecropping, a system that trapped them in cycles of debt and dependency. Landowners would provide the necessary tools, seeds, and land, but the terms were often designed to ensure that tenants owed more than they could earn. Crops were harvested, debts were calculated, and at the end of the year, families frequently found themselves owing the landowner again, with no real opportunity to build wealth or accumulate property. This cycle reinforced dependence and limited mobility, keeping entire communities tethered to the land and to the control of white landowners. Urban areas offered little reprieve. When Black workers migrated to cities seeking industrial employment, they encountered discriminatory hiring practices that restricted them to the lowest-paying jobs in factories, railroads, and construction. White workers often received preferential treatment, and unions were typically segregated, leaving Black workers without collective bargaining power or protection from exploitation. In some cases, Black employees were hired only as a reserve labor force, easily replaceable and always subject to termination if they demanded fair treatment. Housing discrimination further compounded economic oppression, as redlining and restrictive covenants limited access to safe, affordable neighborhoods, forcing Black families into overcrowded and under-resourced areas. Even within small businesses and entrepreneurship, Black communities faced hurdles. Banks often refused loans or offered predatory terms to Black applicants, and local markets were dominated by white-owned enterprises that limited the growth of Black-owned businesses. Those who attempted to build wealth or establish enterprises were often met with boycotts, intimidation, or legal obstacles designed to maintain the status quo. Wealth accumulation, long-term security, and intergenerational prosperity were systematically obstructed, ensuring that poverty persisted across generations. Despite these challenges, Black communities demonstrated remarkable resilience. Informal networks of support, mutual aid societies, and cooperative ventures provided some relief, fostering a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. Schools, churches, and local organizations became hubs for education, skill development, and community empowerment, offering tools to resist economic marginalization. Yet the structural barriers imposed by discriminatory laws and social practices made every step forward a hard-fought victory, a reminder of the persistent economic injustice that shaped daily life. The economic oppression of the Jim Crow era was not simply a consequence of unequal opportunity, it was a deliberate system to suppress the advancement of Black Americans. By controlling access to employment, wages, land, and resources, white-dominated institutions maintained a rigid social hierarchy, keeping entire communities in cycles of poverty and dependence. Understanding this history sheds light on the long-term impacts of systemic inequality and highlights the extraordinary resilience and ingenuity of those who resisted these constraints to build foundations for future generations. In the decades following Reconstruction, the promise of political participation for Black Americans was systematically undermined through a combination of legal maneuvers, bureaucratic obstacles, and outright intimidation. The struggle to cast a vote, a fundamental right in a democratic society, became a daily challenge for Black citizens living under Jim Crow. State and local governments in the South implemented a variety of measures designed to suppress black political engagement, ensuring that white supremacy remained entrenched in every level of governance. Poll taxes became one of the most insidious barriers. These fees, often deceptively small, were required to register to vote. For many black families living in poverty, even a modest tax represented a significant financial burden. Families who could barely afford food, rent, or clothing were forced to choose between survival and civic participation. Landowners and employers sometimes used this as leverage, threatening eviction or dismissal if black workers attempted to pay the tax. In this way, a seemingly neutral financial requirement became a powerful tool to deny an entire community their voice in the political process. Literacy tests added another layer of exclusion. These exams were purportedly designed to assess a voter's understanding of civics, but in practice, they were subjective and applied with stark racial bias. Registrars could demand interpretation of complex passages from the state constitution, or ask questions about obscure historical events, knowing that a black applicant's answers could be arbitrarily judged incorrect. Even well-educated individuals were frequently denied the right to register simply because the examiner wished to maintain racial hierarchy. In many communities, whites were exempted entirely through grandfather clauses that allowed descendants of voters before the Civil War to bypass these tests, cementing the inequity in favor of white citizens. Beyond bureaucratic hurdles, intimidation was a constant presence. Black voters often faced threats of violence, economic retaliation, or public shaming if they attempted to exercise their rights. Towns were patrolled by armed individuals who sought to deter citizens from registering, and political rallies for black candidates were met with harassment or attacks. Families who dared to participate in elections risked retaliation that could affect multiple generations, discouraging voter engagement through fear as effectively as through law. The consequences of this suppression were profound. Without the power to elect representatives, black communities had little influence over policies that directly affected their lives, including education, labor laws, housing, and public safety. Decisions were made without their input, often reinforcing the very inequalities that kept them marginalized. Local officials could enact discriminatory ordinances with impunity, secure in the knowledge that those affected had no voice in the decision-making process. Despite these obstacles, black citizens continued to fight for political agency. Community leaders organized voter education programs, held meetings to navigate the complex registration process, and created mutual aid networks to support those facing retaliation. Churches often became political hubs, providing a space to strategize and mobilize while offering spiritual encouragement. These efforts laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century, demonstrating a remarkable resilience in the face of systemic disenfranchisement. Voting suppression under Jim Crow was not merely an inconvenience, it was a deliberate system designed to prevent black Americans from achieving political representation and influence. By controlling access to the ballot, white-dominated institutions maintained a social and political order that ensured continued oppression. Understanding this history illuminates the persistent struggle for voting rights and the courage of those who resisted barriers to democracy, ensuring that their fight resonates through generations. In the deeply segregated society of the Jim Crow era, personal relationships were subject to rigid racial boundaries enforced by both custom and law. Anti-miscegenation laws, enacted in numerous states across the South and upheld for decades, criminalized romantic and marital relationships between individuals of different races. These laws were more than mere legal restrictions, they were instruments of social control, designed to uphold the ideology of racial purity and to maintain white dominance over every aspect of life, including the most intimate and private spheres. For black Americans, the presence of these laws meant that even love could be a source of danger. Couples who dared to cross racial lines risked arrest, public humiliation, and in some cases, violent retribution from their communities. Social stigma was ever present, with neighbors, law enforcement, and even employers ready to enforce the unwritten codes of racial separation. A relationship that might have been celebrated for its emotional connection instead became a perilous act, fraught with legal and social consequences. Families were torn apart, individuals were ostracized, and fear became a constant companion. The laws varied in detail from state to state, but their intent was uniform: to prevent racial mixing and maintain a clear hierarchy of white supremacy. Courts could dissolve marriages, impose fines, or even mandate imprisonment for those who defied the restrictions. Beyond legal punishment, communities often enacted their own forms of retribution. Rumors and gossip circulated rapidly, and individuals caught in interracial relationships might face threats of violence or economic retaliation. Employers could fire them, landlords could evict them, and entire social networks could turn hostile, leaving couples isolated and vulnerable. These restrictions were grounded in a belief system that framed racial purity as essential to social order. The ideology suggested that the mixing of races threatened the integrity of the white community, justifying extreme measures to prevent it. Schools, churches, and media reinforced these ideas, teaching children from a young age that boundaries between races were inviolable. The laws, therefore, were not only legal tools but also instruments for shaping societal attitudes, embedding racial hierarchy into the very fabric of daily life. Despite the oppressive framework, many individuals challenged these restrictions, quietly forming relationships and families that defied the legal and social codes of the time. These acts of personal courage were often accompanied by significant risk, as discovery could result in severe punishment or public shaming. Stories of couples maintaining their bonds in secret, moving to more tolerant regions, or fighting legal battles to protect their unions illustrate the human desire for connection and the lengths people would go to claim agency over their own lives. The impact of anti-miscegenation laws extended beyond individual relationships. They reinforced the broader system of racial control, signaling to Black Americans that their personal freedoms were subordinate to the maintenance of white dominance. By controlling intimate aspects of life, these laws sent a powerful message: racial boundaries were absolute, and any deviation would be met with harsh consequences. It was not until the landmark Supreme Court case Loving v. Virginia in 1967 that these laws were struck down nationwide, affirming the right of individuals to marry regardless of race. The decision marked a turning point, challenging the legacy of legal restrictions on personal freedom and dismantling one of the many tools used to uphold systemic racial inequality. Understanding the history of anti-miscegenation laws reveals not only the pervasive reach of racial oppression but also the resilience of those who fought for the most fundamental of human rights, the freedom to love and build a life with the person of one's choice. In the era of Jim Crow, the social fabric of the South was tightly woven with invisible yet unyielding rules that governed every interaction between Black and white individuals. These rules, often referred to as racial etiquette, were not mere suggestions but enforced codes that dictated behavior in public, private, and professional spheres. For Black Americans, daily life required constant vigilance and careful navigation. Even the smallest misstep could provoke anger, punishment, or social ostracism from white communities. From the moment a Black person stepped outside their home, they entered a world where every gesture, every word, and even the tone of their voice could be scrutinized. Simple actions such as making eye contact with a white person, speaking too loudly, or walking on a sidewalk reserved for whites could lead to verbal reprimands or worse. Children were taught from a young age to lower their gaze, address white individuals with deferential language, and maintain a submissive posture at all times. Schools and churches reinforced these norms, emphasizing survival through compliance rather than empowerment or self-expression. Public spaces were arenas where racial etiquette was most visibly enforced. In stores, Black patrons were expected to greet white clerks with a smile, refrain from touching items unless invited, and never challenge a price or service. On the streets, they had to step aside when a white person passed, offering polite acknowledgments while hiding any sense of personal grievance. The very design of these spaces, segregated benches, water fountains, and restrooms, reinforced the notion that Black individuals occupied a lower social tier, where independence and dignity were carefully constrained. Work environments presented another layer of restriction. Black laborers were expected to show unquestioned obedience to white supervisors, even when facing unsafe or degrading conditions. Complaints or attempts to negotiate fair treatment could be met with dismissal, threats, or violent retaliation. These expectations extended beyond the professional realm. Social gatherings, religious services, and community events all carried the weight of these unwritten rules, reinforcing a culture of subservience that limited self-expression and reinforced internalized hierarchies. The enforcement of this social code was not always formal. It often relied on intimidation, gossip, and the threat of reputational damage. Black Americans who dared to assert themselves, whether by addressing a white person directly, dressing in ways deemed too assertive, or displaying pride in public achievements, could become targets for ridicule or punishment. Communities learned to police themselves, ensuring that deviations from the etiquette were corrected swiftly to avoid attracting attention from white authorities or neighbors. These customs were deeply psychological as well as social. They trained black individuals to suppress anger, frustration, and even joy in order to survive in a society structured against them. Over time, generations internalized these constraints, carrying the subtle yet persistent burden of always having to measure speech, action, and demeanor against an ever-present standard of subordination. Yet, beneath the surface of forced compliance, resilience and quiet resistance persisted. Families nurtured pride, education, and community solidarity in private spaces, creating networks of strength that would later fuel movements for civil rights and social change. Understanding the pervasive power of racial etiquette reveals the nuanced ways in which oppression extended far beyond laws or violence. It was embedded in daily rituals, in gestures and greetings, in the ways people were expected to move and speak. By imposing limits on dignity and self-expression, these social customs shaped the lived experiences of countless Black Americans, leaving a legacy that continued to influence social interactions long after the formal end of segregation. Yet, within this system, acts of courage and subtle defiance laid the groundwork for generations to reclaim their autonomy, identity, and voice in the face of systemic subordination. Amid the oppressive weight of segregation and systemic discrimination, Black communities displayed extraordinary resilience, transforming spaces of hardship into foundations of strength and hope. In towns and cities across the South, families and neighbors came together to create institutions that would nurture, educate, and empower their members, even when the broader society sought to keep them marginalized. Churches became far more than places of worship, they were safe havens, centers of community organization, and platforms for leadership. Within these walls, Black Americans could express themselves freely, celebrate their culture, and strategize for a better future, all while reinforcing a sense of dignity that segregation tried to strip away. Education, though severely underfunded and limited by law, was another realm where resilience shone. Black teachers and leaders often worked with minimal resources, turning rudimentary classrooms into centers of learning and opportunity. They taught not only reading and arithmetic but also instilled pride in heritage, an understanding of history, and the belief that change was possible. The schools themselves became symbols of defiance, proof that, even under the harshest conditions, knowledge could not be completely denied or controlled. Beyond religious and educational institutions, early civil rights organizations emerged, laying the groundwork for larger movements that would come decades later. Groups formed to advocate for voting rights, fair labor practices, and social justice, often at great personal risk. These organizations fostered leadership, solidarity, and a shared vision, showing that collective action could challenge even deeply entrenched systems of oppression. Local clubs, mutual aid societies, and advocacy networks provided support for families facing economic hardships, legal barriers, and social violence, proving that community could be both a shield and a tool for empowerment. The creative spirit of Black communities also thrived in music, literature, and oral storytelling, preserving history and culture while inspiring resilience. Spirituals, blues, and later jazz and gospel carried messages of hope, endurance, and resistance, reaching beyond the immediate community to influence broader society. These cultural expressions reminded generations of their worth, their shared struggles, and the possibility of a more just world. Through all these efforts, Black communities cultivated a quiet yet formidable power, the ability to survive, to educate, to organize, and to inspire. They showed that even in the face of pervasive inequality and relentless repression, human spirit and solidarity could carve out spaces of freedom, dignity, and growth. The work of these communities laid the essential foundation for the civil rights victories of the mid-20th century, proving that resilience, organization, and shared purpose could turn oppression into opportunity for transformation. The story of these communities is a testament to courage, determination, and hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, collective effort and unwavering faith in justice can sow the seeds of change. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel to explore more untold histories and inspiring stories of resilience.